Sarah Martinez pushed her shopping cart through the automatic doors of Megamart, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. She had exactly $43.62 to feed herself for the next 2 weeks. Again, the accounting job at Morrison & Associates barely covered rent, utilities, and her student loan payments, leaving grocery shopping as an exercise in creative mathematics. She grabbed a cart with a wobbly wheel, because of course she did, and pulled out her crumpled shopping list. Rice, beans, pasta, whatever vegetables were on clearance, and maybe, if she was lucky, some chicken that was about to expire. The glamorous life of a 26-year-old college graduate in the big city. The produce section stretched before her like a maze of overpriced nutrition. Sarah had become an expert at finding the bruised apples, the slightly wilted lettuce, the tomatoes that stores marked down because they had a day or two left before going bad. She was examining a bag of carrots that looked like they'd seen better days when she heard the voice. "Excuse me, miss." Sarah turned around and nearly dropped the carrots. Standing behind her was the most unusual man she'd ever seen. He was tall. Not just tall, but towering, easily 7 feet, with broad shoulders that seemed to strain against his expensive-looking black suit. His skin had an odd, almost metallic sheen to it, and his eyes were the color of molten gold. When he smiled, she could swear she saw teeth that were just a little too sharp. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you," he said, his voice carrying a strange accent she couldn't place. It sounded ancient somehow, like rocks grinding together, but refined, like he'd gone to the finest schools. "I find myself in need of assistance with human food procurement." Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" The man's golden eyes flickered with what might have been embarrassment. "I am new to shopping for groceries. I was wondering if you might help me understand what humans typically purchase for sustenance." There was something odd about the way he phrased things, like English wasn't his first language, even though he spoke it perfectly. Sarah glanced around the produce section. It was Tuesday afternoon, so the store was mostly empty except for a few other shoppers who seemed to be giving the strange man a wide berth. "You've never bought groceries before?" she asked. "Not exactly." He shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah could have sworn she heard the faint sound of scales scraping against fabric. "I have recently found myself in a position where I must learn to blend in with human society." Food procurement seemed like a logical place to start. Sarah studied his face. There was something vulnerable in those golden eyes, something that reminded her of how she'd felt during her first week in the city. Lost, out of place, trying to figure out how normal people lived. Plus, he was dressed in what was obviously an expensive suit, so it wasn't like he was trying to scam her out of money. "Okay," she said slowly. "I guess I could help you out. Fair warning, though, I'm not exactly shopping for gourmet meals here. I'm on a pretty tight budget." The man's entire face lit up. "Budget shopping. Yes, this would be most educational. I need to understand how average humans manage their resources." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "All right, Mr. Draken," he said quickly. "You may call me Draken. I'm Sada. Nice to meet you, Draken." She gestured toward her cart. "So, lesson 1 in budget grocery shopping. Clearance produce is your friend." For the next hour, Sarah found herself giving Draken a comprehensive tour of bargain shopping. She showed him how to check expiration dates, how to spot which items were about to be marked down, and the art of buying generic brands instead of name brands. Draken listened with intense concentration, asking detailed questions about everything from the nutritional value of different grains to the cultural significance of certain spice combinations. What struck Sarah as odd was how he reacted to certain foods. When they passed the meat section, his nostrils flared, and his eyes seemed to glow brighter. When she showed him the spice aisle, he spent several minutes just breathing deeply, as if memorizing every scent. And when they reached the section with hot sauce and peppers, he practically vibrated with excitement. "These capsaicin-based flavor enhancers," he said, picking up a bottle of ghost pepper sauce. "They are quite popular among humans?" "Well, some humans," Sarah said. "That particular one would probably melt most people's faces off." Draken carefully read the label, which warned about the extreme heat level in multiple languages. "Fascinating. And humans consume this voluntarily." The brave ones do, or the stupid ones. The jury's still out on which category they fall into. Draken actually laughed at that, a warm, rumbling sound that seemed to resonate in Sarah's chest. I believe I would like to try this. Are you sure? That stuff is seriously hot. I have a robust constitution when it comes to heat tolerance. Sarah shrugged. Your funeral. Literally, maybe. They continued through the store, Draken carefully selecting items based on Sarah's recommendations. He seemed particularly interested in foods that could be prepared quickly and easily, claiming that his schedule was quite demanding. When Sarah mentioned that she often made large batches of stew or chili that could be portioned out for multiple meals, Draken's eyes practically lit up. Efficiency in food preparation, he murmured, making notes on his phone. Yes, this is exactly the type of practical knowledge I require. As they reached the checkout lanes, Sarah realized her own cart was looking pretty sparse. The $43 wasn't going as far as she'd hoped, especially with grocery prices the way they were lately. She'd had to put back the chicken and settle for just rice, beans, pasta, and a few vegetables that were on her last legs. Draken seemed to notice her contemplating her meager selection. You have been most generous with your time and knowledge, he said. Please, allow me to express my gratitude. Before Sarah could protest, he was flagging down a store manager and speaking in rapid, hushed tones. Sarah caught snippets of what sounded like financial terms, credit limits, payment methods, account authorizations. The manager kept nodding and looking increasingly impressed, occasionally glancing at Sarah with newfound respect. Mr. Draken has requested that we transfer your purchases to his account, the manager said to Sarah a few minutes later. He's also asked us to fill an additional cart with groceries of your choosing. Sarah stared. I'm sorry, what? Think of it as payment for consulting services, Draken said smoothly. You have provided me with invaluable education in human resource management. I can't let you buy my groceries, Sarah protested. That's way too much. I just showed you around the store for an hour. And in that hour, you likely saved me weeks of trial and error, Draken replied. In my business dealings, such efficiency is worth considerably more than a cart of food. The manager was already calling over several store employees to help load up a second cart. Mr. Draken has one of our premium corporate accounts, he explained to Sarah in hushed tones. We're authorized to accommodate special requests. Sarah found herself speechless as Draken guided her through the store a second time, this time encouraging her to pick up all the items she'd had to skip due to budget constraints. Fresh meat, good vegetables, real cheese instead of the processed stuff, even some of the fancy yogurt she'd been eyeing earlier. I really can't accept all this, she said as they loaded the second cart. Consider it an investment, Draken said mysteriously. I suspect our paths will cross again. And when they do, I want to ensure you are well-nourished and prepared for whatever challenges may arise. There was something in his tone that made Sarah look at him more carefully. For just a moment, his golden eyes seemed to flash with an inner light, and she could have sworn she saw something ancient and powerful looking back at her. Then he blinked, and he was just a tall, well-dressed man with unusual eyes who'd bought her groceries. At the checkout, Sarah watched the total climb higher and higher, easily over $300 for both carts combined. Draken didn't even blink when the cashier announced the final amount. He simply handed over a black credit card that the cashier examined with obvious reverence. Will you be needing assistance loading these into your vehicle? The cashier asked. Ms. Martinez will be taking the smaller cart, Draken said. I'll have my associates collect the other items later. As they walked out to the parking lot, Sarah pushing her cart full of more groceries than she usually bought in a month, she kept trying to process what had just happened. Draken, I have to ask, what exactly do you do for work? That was a lot of money you just spent without even thinking about it. Draken paused beside her beat-up Honda Civic, looking suddenly uncertain again. I am in international acquisitions. My organization specializes in recovering items of significant value that have been lost or stolen. Like a private investigator? Something like that. He helped her load the groceries into her car, handling the heavy bags like they weighed nothing. Sarah, I hope this is not too forward, but would it be possible to exchange contact information? Your knowledge of human customs and resource management could be quite valuable to my organization." Sarah hesitated. Everything about this situation was weird, from Draken's strange way of speaking to his casual display of wealth to the way he'd made that manager practically bow and scrape. But he just bought her enough groceries to last a month, and despite his oddness, she hadn't gotten any dangerous vibes from him. If anything, he seemed more nervous than threatening. "Sure," she said finally, pulling out her phone. "But, fair warning, I'm just an accountant. I don't know how much help I'd be with international acquisitions or whatever it is you do." "You might be surprised," Draken said cryptically as they exchanged numbers. "In my experience, humans often underestimate their own capabilities." They parted ways in the parking lot, Draken walking toward a section of the lot that Sarah couldn't quite see clearly. She drove home with her mind spinning, trying to figure out what had just happened and whether she made a terrible mistake by giving her number to a complete stranger. Her apartment was a tiny studio in a converted warehouse, but it felt like a palace when she started unloading all the groceries Draken had bought. Real meat that wasn't marked down for quick sale. Fresh vegetables that weren't wilted. Cheese that probably cost more per pound than she usually spent on groceries in a week. As she put everything away, Sarah found herself thinking about Draken's strange mannerisms, his formal way of speaking, and those unsettling golden eyes. The rational part of her mind insisted that he was probably just a wealthy eccentric, maybe from another country where they did things differently. But there had been something else, something that made her feel like she just had an encounter with something far more significant than a random meeting in the grocery store. She was putting the last of the vegetables in her refrigerator when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you again for your assistance today. Your kindness will not be forgotten." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you for the groceries." That was incredibly generous. The response came almost immediately. Generosity had nothing to do with it. You showed respect and dignity to a stranger in need. Such behavior is rare in any species. Rest well, Sarah Martinez. I suspect you will need your strength in the days to come. Sarah read the message 3 times, focusing on that one word, species. It was probably just an odd translation from whatever his native language was, but something about it made her shiver. She spent the rest of the evening cooking a real meal for the first time in months. Fresh vegetables, actual meat, herbs, and spices she'd forgotten she enjoyed. As she ate, she kept thinking about Draken and his promise that their paths would cross again. She had no idea how right he was, or that in less than 48 hours, her quiet life as a struggling accountant would be turned completely upside down by forces beyond her imagination. All because she'd been kind to a strange man in a grocery store who needed help learning how humans lived. But that night, Sarah simply went to bed with a full stomach and a lingering sense that she'd stumbled into something much larger than a chance encounter. As she drifted off to sleep, she could have sworn she heard the distant sound of wings beating against the night sky, but when she looked out her window, there was nothing but empty darkness. The next morning brought news reports of unusual seismic activity in the mountains outside the city. Geological surveys were baffled by readings that suggested something massive was moving deep underground, but the reports were buried in the back pages of newspapers and dismissed as equipment malfunctions. Sarah saw the reports during her lunch break at work, but didn't think much of them. She had no way of knowing that those mysterious seismic readings were connected to her new acquaintance, or that word of their encounter had already reached the highest levels of multiple galactic governments. In the deepest archives of the Interstellar Commerce Authority, a file was being updated with new information about an entity known only as the Keeper of Ancient Treasures. The file noted that the entity had made contact with a human female named Sarah Martinez, and that this contact had been characterized by an exchange of resources rather than the typical pattern of intimidation and territorial displays. This was unprecedented. The Keeper had not interacted peacefully with any species in over 2,000 years. The implications were being debated in emergency sessions across 3-star systems, with experts trying to understand what had changed and what it might mean for the delicate balance of galactic politics. But Sarah knew none of this as she returned to her accounting job, processing invoices and balancing books with no idea that she had just become one of the most important humans in the galaxy. She simply went about her normal routine, occasionally thinking about the strange man who'd bought her groceries and wondering if she'd ever see him again. She would have her answer sooner than she expected. 3 days after her encounter with Draken, Sarah's life had settled back into its normal rhythm. The groceries he'd bought her were still stocked in her refrigerator, a constant reminder of the strange afternoon that was starting to feel more like a vivid dream than actual reality. She'd texted him once to thank him again, but hadn't received a response. Sarah was working late at Morrison & Associates, trying to reconcile a client's quarterly books that were more tangled than Christmas lights, when the first sign of trouble appeared. The office building's lights began flickering, not like a power surge, but in a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. "That's weird," muttered Jake from the next cubicle over. "Probably just the city working on the electrical grid again." But Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the pattern seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. She saved her work and glanced out the window at the street below. Everything looked normal. Evening traffic, people walking home from work, the usual urban bustle of a Thursday night. Then she saw them. At first, they just looked like particularly well-dressed people standing on the sidewalk across the street. But as Sarah watched, she realized they weren't moving like normal pedestrians. They stood perfectly still, all facing the same direction, toward her building. And there were more of them than she'd initially noticed, positioned at regular intervals along the entire block. Sarah squinted, trying to get a better look. Even from 8 stories up, she could tell these people were unusual. They all wore identical dark suits, and they all had the same rigid posture, like soldiers at attention. But it was their faces that made her stomach drop. Even at this distance, she could see that their skin had the same metallic sheen as Draken's. And when one of them looked up directly at her window, she saw the unmistakable flash of golden eyes. Her phone rang, making her jump so hard she knocked her coffee mug off her desk. "Sarah Martinez," she answered, her voice shakier than she'd intended. "Sarah." The voice was Draken's, but something was wrong. He sounded tense, urgent. "Listen to me very carefully. You are in danger. Do not leave the building through the main entrance. Is there another way out?" Sarah's heart started pounding. "Draken? What's going on?" "There are people outside, and they look like me," Draken finished grimly. "Yes, they are my relatives, you might say, and they're not here to exchange pleasantries. Sarah, I need you to trust me. Is there a service entrance or a loading dock?" Sarah's mind raced. "There's a loading dock in the basement, but Draken, I don't understand. Why would your relatives want to hurt me? I haven't done anything." "You helped me," Draken said simply. "In my culture, that creates certain obligations. Obligations that some of my kin find inconvenient. Please, Sarah, go to the loading dock. Stay on the phone with me." Sarah grabbed her purse and headed for the emergency stairs, her hands shaking as she pushed through the stairwell door. "Jake, I have to go," she called over her shoulder. "Family emergency." "But you're not done with the Henderson account." Jake started to protest, but Sarah was already gone. The stairwell was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Her footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she hurried down 8 flights, Draken's voice in her ear the only thing keeping her from complete panic. "Good," he said when she told him she was in the stairwell. "Sarah, I need to explain something to you, and you're going to think I'm insane." "I'm already thinking that," Sarah gasped, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "People who look like you are surrounding my building. You're talking about relatives and obligations like we're in some kind of fantasy novel, and I'm sneaking out of my own office building like I'm in a spy movie. Insane doesn't even begin to cover it." "Fair enough." Draken's voice was grim. "Sarah, I'm not entirely human. Neither are the individuals currently hunting you. We are what humans would call dragons." Sarah stopped dead on the 5th floor landing. "Dragons? You're telling me you're a dragon?" "Yes. Like wings and fire and hoarding treasure dragons." Among other things, yes. Sarah started moving again, partly because standing still felt more dangerous, and partly because she needed to do something with the adrenaline flooding her system. Okay, sure, dragons. Because my week wasn't weird enough already. Sarah, I know how this sounds. Do you? Do you really? Because I'm pretty sure you've never had someone call you up and casually mention that they're a mythical creature while you're being hunted by their relatives. Despite everything, Draken actually chuckled. You're taking this better than most humans would. I'm having a complete breakdown, Sarah informed him, reaching the second floor. I'm just having it while functional. It's a useful skill in accounting. Listen, Draken continued, his tone becoming serious again. My kind has certain laws about interactions with humans. For millennia, we have maintained strict separation. Humans are not supposed to know of our existence, and we are not supposed to involve ourselves in human affairs. Sarah reached the basement level and pushed through the door into a utilitarian hallway lined with storage rooms and maintenance equipment. Let me guess, buying groceries for a human counts as involving yourself in human affairs. Spectacularly so. Sarah, when I asked for your help at the store, I violated one of our oldest and most sacred laws. And when you helped me without asking for anything in return, you inadvertently created what we call a life debt. Sarah found the loading dock, a large garage door with a smaller personnel entrance beside it. She peered out the wire-reinforced window and saw two more figures in dark suits standing in the alley. What exactly is a life debt? It means I owe you my life, literally. In dragon culture, such debts are binding and absolute. They can only be discharged through significant action on the debtor's part. So you could just, I don't know, buy me a car and call it even? If only it were that simple. The debt can only be considered paid when I have preserved your life in return, preferably at significant risk to my own. Sarah stared out at the figures in the alley, pieces starting to fall into place. And your relatives don't like that you owe a human a life debt. My relatives consider humans to be barely above livestock in terms of intelligence and significance. The idea that one of their own could owe such a debt to what they see as a lower life form is culturally unacceptable. So they're here to kill me. They're here to eliminate the source of what they see as my dishonor, yes. Sarah felt a hysterical laugh building in her chest. This is insane. 3 days ago, I was worried about making rent, and now I'm hiding for dragons who want to kill me because I helped you figure out which pasta sauce was on sale. Sarah, I want you to listen very carefully. Do you see a dumpster near the loading dock? Sarah looked around the alley. Yeah, there's a big blue one about 20 feet from the door. I want you to run to that dumpster and hide behind it. Don't ask questions, don't hesitate, just run and hide. Do you understand? Draken, there are two of your relatives standing right there. They'll see me the second I open the door. No, they won't. Trust me. Something in his tone made Sarah believe him. Okay, but if I die because I trusted a dragon I met at the grocery store, I'm going to be really annoyed. Duly noted. On my mark. 3, 2, 1 now. Sarah burst through the personnel door and sprinted across the alley toward the dumpster. She was certain the two figures would spot her immediately, but something extraordinary happened. A wall of flame erupted from above, creating a curtain of fire between her and the watchers. The heat was intense, but not burning, like standing near a very large campfire rather than being inside one. She dove behind the dumpster just as she heard the sound of something massive landing in the alley. The impact shook the ground and rattled the windows of the surrounding buildings. Sarah peeked around the edge of the dumpster and nearly fainted. A dragon, an actual, honest-to-goodness dragon, was crouched in the alley between her and the two figures in suits. It was magnificent and terrifying, easily the size of a city bus, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian in the streetlights. Its eyes were the same molten gold as Draken's, and when it opened its mouth to roar a challenge, she could see rows of teeth designed for tearing through anything that got in its way. The two figures responded by changing shape themselves, their human forms rippling and expanding like heat mirages until two smaller dragons stood in their place. They were impressive in their own right, but nothing compared to the massive black dragon that was clearly Draken. What followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, even in movies. The three dragons fought with a combination of raw physical power and strategic intelligence that was both beautiful and terrifying. Flame met flame in brilliant displays that lit up the entire alley. Claws sparked against scales like metal striking stone, and the sound of their roars echoed off the buildings like thunder. Draken was clearly the superior fighter. He moved with fluid grace despite his size, using his bulk and experience to keep his two opponents from coordinating their attacks. When one tried to flank him, he pivoted smoothly and caught it with a tail strike that sent it crashing into a brick wall. When the other attempted to get airborne for a dive attack, Draken leaped higher than seemed possible for something his size and dragged it back down with claws that left gouges in the concrete. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah. When it was over, both of Draken's opponents were sprawled unconscious in the alley, their dragon forms slowly shifting back to human appearance. Draken himself stood over them, breathing heavily but clearly victorious. Then he looked directly at Sarah, and she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There was intelligence in those golden eyes, ancient, vast intelligence that made her feel like a child looking up at the stars and trying to comprehend infinity. The dragon that was Draken began to change, the massive form folding in on itself until the familiar tall man in the expensive suit stood where the creature had been. His clothes were somehow undamaged, though his hair was disheveled, and there was a small cut on his cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, walking over to help her up from behind the dumpster. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. "You're actually a dragon." "Yes." "You just fought 2 other dragons in an alley behind my office building." "Yes." "This is really happening." "I'm afraid so." Sarah looked at the 2 unconscious figures on the ground. "Are they dead?" "No. Merely subdued. They'll wake up in a few hours with significant headaches and hopefully a better understanding of the consequences of challenging me directly." "Will they come back?" Draken's expression grew troubled. "These 2 were scouts, testing my resolve and your defenses when they report back that I'm actively protecting you." He paused. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight was just the beginning. By defending you openly, I've essentially declared war on my own kind." Sarah felt her knees go weak. "Va? Because of me? Because of principles?" Draken corrected gently. "You showed kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. In a universe where most beings act purely out of self-interest, that kind of genuine compassion is rare and precious. It deserves protection. But your own family, my kind," Draken said firmly, "not my family. Dragons are not raised in family units the way humans are. We are solitary creatures who come together only when necessary. What binds us is law and tradition, not affection." Sarah looked around the alley, at the scorch marks on the walls, and the cracked concrete where the dragons had fought. "So what happens now? Now we prepare for the real fight. The Council of Elders will have to respond to what happened tonight. They cannot allow a dragon to openly defy their laws without consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Draken's expression grew grim. "The kind that will make tonight's encounter look like a minor disagreement." Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. "Draken, I can't let you start a war because I helped you buy groceries. There has to be another way. Can't we just explain to your council that it was all innocent, that I don't know any secrets or pose any threat? Unfortunately, it's no longer about what you know or don't know. It's about precedent. If they allow me to discharge my life debt to you through protection rather than through more traditional means, it could encourage other dragons to interact more freely with humans. They see that as an existential threat to our way of life. Traditional means usually involves ensuring that the human in question becomes wealthy, powerful, or famous enough that saving their life becomes a significant achievement, preferably through methods that appear to be natural human success rather than supernatural intervention." Sarah thought about this. "So you could have just what secretly manipulated my career until I became a successful CEO or something, then stage some dramatic rescue. That was my initial plan, yes. It would have taken several years and required considerable behind-the-scenes maneuvering, but it would have been within acceptable parameters. So why didn't you do that instead of this whole direct protection thing? Draken was quiet for a moment, looking down at the unconscious dragons. Because spending an hour with you in that grocery store taught me something I hadn't learned in 3,000 years of existence. What? He met her eyes, and Sarah saw something vulnerable there, something that reminded her of the uncertainty he'd shown when asking for help with human food procurement. That some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting makes everything more complicated. Before Sarah could respond to that, her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Then another, and another. She pulled it out and saw news notifications flooding her screen. Mysterious seismic activity, unexplained atmospheric disturbances, and reports of unusual lights in the sky over multiple major cities. That would be the Council mobilizing, Draken said grimly, reading the alerts over her shoulder. Sarah, I need to get you somewhere safe while I figure out our next move. Somewhere safe? Draken, if what you're telling me is true, there's nowhere on Earth that's safe from dragons. Actually, Draken said, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, there are a few places. But you're not going to like where we have to go. Sarah looked at the unconscious dragons, the scorch marks on the alley walls, and the emergency alerts still flooding her phone. 3 days ago, her biggest worry had been whether she could afford name-brand pasta sauce. You know what? She said finally. At this point, I'm pretty sure my insurance doesn't cover dragon attacks anyway. Lead the way. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting in the passenger seat of a black SUV that definitely hadn't been parked in the alley when she'd arrived. Draken drove with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been navigating crisis situations for millennia, which, given what she'd learned about him tonight, was probably accurate. Where exactly are we going? Sarah asked as they merged onto the highway heading out of the city. The emergency alerts on her phone had multiplied and now included reports of mysterious aircraft that didn't appear on radar and unexplained electromagnetic disturbances. The Cascade Mountains, Draken replied. There's a place there that's been neutral territory for over 1,000 years. Even the Council respects its boundaries. Sarah looked out the window at the city lights receding behind them. Let me guess, another dragon lives there? Not exactly. Draken's expression grew complicated. Have you ever heard of the Pacific Northwest legends about creatures that help lost hikers? Rangers finding people who should have died of exposure perfectly safe and well-fed, with no memory of how they survived. Bigfoot. Draken actually laughed. Close. The locals call them Sasquatch, but they're actually a subspecies of what humans might recognize as giants. They're about as far from dragon society as you can get while still being considered supernatural beings. Sarah, try to process this. So we're going to hide with giants. We're going to ask for sanctuary with beings who have no political ties to dragon culture and a long history of protecting humans who stumble into situations beyond their understanding. They drove in silence for a while, Sarah watching the suburban sprawl give way to farmland and then to forests. The radio was full of confused reports about the atmospheric disturbances, with meteorologists unable to explain readings that suggested massive objects moving through the upper atmosphere. Draken, Sarah said eventually, can I ask you something that might be really stupid? After the evening we've had, I doubt anything you ask could qualify as stupid. Why didn't you just eat me? Draken nearly drove off the road. I'm sorry, what? I mean, when I met you at the store, you were obviously hungry, and according to every story I've ever heard, dragons eat people. Why did you ask for help instead of just, Draken was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Dragons haven't eaten humans for over 2,000 years, he said. We learned early on that intelligent prey develops unpleasant emotional resonances that affect the taste. It's much more efficient to consume livestock or wild game. Emotional resonances? Fear, anger, grief. They create chemical changes in the meat that make it bitter and difficult to digest. Dragons who regularly consumed sentient beings often developed what humans might recognize as severe psychological disorders. Sarah thought about this. So you stopped eating people because it gave you indigestion and mental health problems. That's a remarkably accurate summary, yes. But you still could if you wanted to. Theoretically. But why would I want to consume something that would make me sick when there are perfectly good alternatives available? It was such a pragmatic explanation that Sarah found it oddly reassuring. So, when you're in the grocery store, you were shopping for the same reason I was, because you needed food, and that's where food comes from. Exactly. The difference is that I had never done it before. My kind typically hunts for sustenance, but I've been living among humans for several months now, trying to understand your culture. Walking into a forest and bringing down an elk would have attracted attention. Sarah realized something. You said you've been living among humans for months. Why? Draken's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Because there are disturbing changes happening in dragon society. Changes that some of us believe could have serious consequences for both our species and yours. What kind of changes? The younger generations of dragons are becoming increasingly aggressive toward humans. They see your technological advancement as a threat to the secrecy that has protected us for millennia. Some are advocating for preventive measures. The way he said preventive measures made Sarah's blood run cold. Preventive like what? Like ensuring that human civilization never advances to the point where it could pose a credible threat to dragons. Sarah stared at him. You're talking about genocide. I'm talking about a faction within my species that believes the only way to ensure their survival is to limit human technological development. They call themselves the Flame Covenant. And you disagree with them. I believe that attempting to control or destroy human civilization would ultimately destroy us as well. You've achieved in centuries what took us millennia. Your capacity for innovation, cooperation, and adaptation is extraordinary. Destroying that would be both morally reprehensible and strategically foolish. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How many dragons think like the Flame Covenant? Enough to be dangerous, not enough to act openly. Yet, they drove deeper into the mountains, the road becoming narrower and more winding. Sarah's phone lost signal entirely, and the radio dissolved into static. The only sound were the engine and the wind through the trees. Draken, Sarah said, what happens if your council decides that your life debt to me is worth going to war over? Then, the conflict between the traditionalists and the Flame Covenant becomes irrelevant, because they'll unite against the bigger threat of dragons forming alliances with humans. And that would be bad. That would be catastrophic. A unified dragon faction determined to eliminate human threats could devastate your civilization before your governments even understood what was happening. Sarah thought about the seismic readings and atmospheric disturbances that had been reported on the news. When you say devastate, dragons have capabilities that your science fiction writers have barely imagined. We can fly faster than your aircraft, generate electromagnetic pulses that would cripple your technology, and coordinate attacks across multiple continents simultaneously. If my kind ever truly united for war against humanity, it would be over before your species knew it had begun. The weight of this settled over Sarah like a cold blanket. So by helping you buy groceries, I've potentially triggered a war between dragons and humans. By helping me buy groceries, you've revealed that cooperation between our species is possible. Whether that leads to war or peace depends on what we do next. They turned off the main road onto a dirt track that seemed to wind randomly through the forest. Sarah couldn't see any signs or markers, but Draken drove as if he knew exactly where he was going. How do you know about this place? She asked. I've been here before. About 50 years ago, I had a disagreement with the council over a matter of dragon law. I needed time to think without interference. What kind of disagreement? Draken was quiet for a moment. I suggested that our policy of complete separation from humans was becoming unsustainable as your technology advanced. I proposed limited, carefully managed contact to ensure peaceful coexistence. Let me guess, they didn't like that idea. They exiled me for 2 years and declared that any dragon found implementing such contact without council approval would be subject to summary execution. Sarah felt her heart sink. And now you're implementing exactly that kind of contact. Now I'm discovering that I was right 50 years ago, and the consequences of waiting this long to address the problem have made everything much more complicated. The dirt track ended in a small clearing surrounded by ancient cedar trees that must have been growing for centuries. There was no visible structure, but Draken parked the SUV and got out as if they'd arrived at their destination. "Stay close to me," he said as Sarah climbed out of the passenger seat. "The Guardians here are protective of their territory." "Guardians?" Before Draken could answer, the trees began to move. It took Sarah a moment to realize that what she'd thought were particularly thick tree trunks were actually legs. Enormous, moss-covered legs attached to creatures that rose from the forest floor like living mountains. They were humanoid in shape, but easily 15 feet tall with long arms and broad shoulders covered in what looked like bark and vegetation. Their faces were ancient and wise, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with intelligence. "Sasquatch," Sarah breathed. The largest of the creatures stepped forward, moving with surprising grace for something its size. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through old trees, deep and resonant and somehow comforting. "Dragon child," it said, looking down at Draken. "You returned to us in troubled times." "Eldest Ironbark," Draken replied, inclining his head respectfully. "I seek sanctuary for myself and the human under my protection." Ironbark's ancient eyes shifted to Sarah, and she felt as if she was being evaluated by something infinitely older and wiser than herself. "The small one carries the scent of destiny," the creature said finally. "Strange currents move around her. She is the reason I need sanctuary. My kind seeks to harm her for the crime of showing kindness to a stranger." "Kindness," Ironbark repeated, as if tasting the word. "A rare commodity in these times, and rarer still between species." Another of the giants stepped forward, smaller than Ironbark, but still massive. "The sky chilled her mass in the high places," it reported. "Many wings, much anger. They seek something in the lowlands." Draken's expression grew grim. "How many?" "More than the stars that shine above the canopy," the smaller giant replied. "They come from the 4 directions." Sarah felt her knees go weak. How many dragons are there in the world?" "Fewer than you might think," Draken said. "But more than enough to be a problem." "Ironbark, I know I ask much, but peace, dragon child." Ironbark raised one massive hand. "The Council of Trees has already spoken. You and your human friend may shelter here as long as needed. But know that our protection extends only to our territory. Beyond the sacred grove, you face your troubles alone." "I understand." Ironbark gestured toward the center of the clearing, and Sarah saw that what she'd taken for a natural depression was actually a carefully constructed shelter built into the earth itself. It was invisible from any distance, covered with living vegetation and perfectly camouflaged. "You will find provisions and comfort below," Ironbark said. "Rest while you may. The storm that comes will test more than your resolve." As the giants melted back into the forest, becoming indistinguishable from the trees once again, Draken led Sarah toward the hidden shelter. "They seem nice," Sarah said, trying to process the fact that she'd just had a conversation with creatures she'd previously thought were myth. "The Sasquatch are the closest thing this world has to true neutrality," Draken explained as they descended stone steps that led down into the earth. "They've survived longer than any other supernatural species by refusing to take sides in conflicts and offering sanctuary to those who need it." The underground shelter was surprisingly comfortable, with sleeping areas carved directly into the rock walls and a central area with a natural spring and a ventilation system that somehow provided fresh air without any visible openings to the surface. Soft bioluminescent plants provided gentle lighting. "How long do we need to stay here?" Sarah asked, settling onto one of the stone benches. "That depends on what the council decides to do," Draken said, "and on whether I can find a way to resolve this situation without starting a war." Sarah looked around their underground refuge, thinking about everything that had happened since she'd offered to help a strange man learn how to buy groceries. "Draken," Can I ask you something else? Of course. When you said that some things are worth fighting for even when fighting makes everything more complicated, did you mean that helping me was worth starting a war with your own species? Draken was quiet for a long moment, staring at the gentle glow of the cave walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Sarah, in 3,000 years of existence, I have never met a being of any species who offered help to a stranger without calculating what they might gain from the interaction. You spent an hour teaching me about human resource management, asked for nothing in return, and when I offered payment, you tried to refuse it. That's just basic decency. That's my point exactly. What you call basic decency is so rare in a larger universe that most species have forgotten it exists. You treated me like a person who needed help, not like a potential threat or resource to be exploited. Sarah thought about this. And that's worth going to war over? That's worth fighting to preserve, Draken said firmly. Because if we lose the capacity for basic decency between species, then we've lost something more important than territory or resources or even survival. Outside their shelter, thunder rolled across the mountains, but Sarah suspected it wasn't a natural storm. Somewhere above them, forces were gathering that could reshape the relationship between humans and dragons forever. And at the center of it all was the simple fact that she'd been kind to a stranger in a grocery store. Sarah woke to the sound of something massive moving through the forest above them. The underground shelter trembled slightly, as if freight trains were passing overhead, but she knew the sound was wings, lots of wings. They've arrived, Draken said quietly. He was sitting near the natural spring, apparently having not slept at all. In the dim bioluminescent light, his golden eyes seemed to glow with inner fire. Sarah checked her watch. 4:30 a.m. She'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours, but it felt like minutes. How many are up there? Based on the sound patterns? At least 24, probably more arriving by the hour. More thunderous wing beats passed overhead, close enough that small pebbles shook loose from the ceiling and fell into the spring with soft plops. Are we safe down here? As long as we stay within the sacred grove, yes. Ironbark's people have protected this place for over 1,000 years. Even dragons respect the ancient agreements. Sarah rubbed her eyes, trying to wake up fully. What kind of agreements? The Sasquatch were the first intelligent species humans encountered when your ancestors migrated to this continent. They could have driven early humans away, or worse, but instead they chose to help lost travelers and protect those who showed respect for the forest. When dragons first arrived in this region, the Sasquatch made it clear that their neutrality was absolute, and their protection was available to anyone who honored their laws. What laws? No violence within the sacred groves. No taking more than you need. No harming the forest or its creatures. And no bringing outside conflicts into their territory. The rumble of wings grew louder, and now Sarah could hear voices, deep, resonant voices speaking in a language that seemed to consist entirely of consonants and rolling sounds. They're talking, she observed. Arguing, more likely. Dragons don't gather in groups this large without disagreement. We're territorial by nature. Sarah stood and moved closer to Draken. What are they arguing about? Probably whether to demand that the Sasquatch hand us over, or to simply wait until we leave neutral territory. And if they demand we be handed over, then Ironbark will politely explain the rules of sanctuary and suggest they direct their grievances elsewhere. And if they decide to wait, Draken's expression grew troubled. Then we have a siege situation. We can't stay here indefinitely, but leaving means facing whatever they plan for us. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft tapping came from above. Sarah looked up to see a section of the ceiling sliding away, revealing one of the Sasquatch crouched at what must be a cleverly concealed entrance. Dragon Child, the creature said in its deep, wind-through-trees voice. Your Skykin request audience. They speak of ancient laws and binding oaths. Draken stood, his entire body tensing. Which of my kind speaks for them? One who calls herself Scalekeeper Valdris of the Western Peaks. She bears the staff of formal challenge. Sarah saw Draken actually pale at this news. A formal challenge? Here, what's a formal challenge? Sarah asked. Dragon law allows for certain disputes to be resolved through single combat, Draken explained grimly. If the challenger bears the staff of formal challenge, the challenge party is honor-bound to respond or be declared outlaw by the entire species. And being declared outlaw means what exactly? It means any dragon has the right to kill me on sight, and no law or tradition will protect me. The Sasquatch leaned down further into the shelter. The Scalekeeper says she will speak with you under the protection of the grove. No violence may occur, but you must hear her words. Draken looked at Sarah. I have to go up there. But you should stay here. Absolutely not, Sarah said immediately. I'm not staying in this cave while you go face some kind of dragon court-martial alone. Sarah, these are beings who could incinerate you with a thought. Your presence might make negotiations more difficult, or it might remind them that this whole thing started because of a simple act of human kindness. Maybe they need to see what they're really fighting about. Before Draken could argue further, the Sasquatch spoke again. The human friend is wise. The Scalekeeper has specifically requested her presence. Draken's eyes flashed with alarm. She asked for Sarah specifically? By name and description, yes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. That can't be good. They followed the Sasquatch up a winding tunnel that emerged in the center of the clearing. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but the natural beauty of the scene was overshadowed by what filled the air above them. Dragons, dozens of them, circling in precise formations that spoke of military discipline. They ranged in size from creatures barely larger than eagles to monsters that could have served as aircraft carriers. Their scales caught the morning light like jeweled armor. Emerald green, deep blue, burnished gold, silver like liquid mercury. And standing in the center of the clearing was the most magnificent and terrifying dragon Sarah had ever seen. This had to be Scalekeeper Valdris. She was larger than Draken's dragon form, with scales that shifted between deep purple and black like oil on water. Her eyes were not gold, but pure silver, and they seemed to see everything at once. In one massive claw, she held a staff made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When she spoke, her voice resonated with authority that made the ground tremble. Draken of the Northern Reaches, she said formally, you stand accused of violating the separation laws, creating unlawful bonds with lesser species, and bringing dishonor upon dragonkind through your actions. How do you answer these charges? Draken stepped forward, and Sarah watched his human form shimmer slightly as he fought to maintain it in the presence of so much draconic power. I answer that my actions were justified under the law of necessary adaptation, he replied, his voice carrying clearly despite his smaller size. The circumstances required immediate decision-making that could not accommodate traditional consultation with the council. Valdris's silver eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like an ant being examined by a scientist. And you, human child, what is your part in this violation? Sarah's throat felt dry as sand, but she forced herself to speak. I helped a stranger who asked for assistance. That's all. That is all, Valdris repeated, her tone suggesting this was somehow inadequate. You bound a dragon to you through debt law, without understanding the consequences. You forced one of the most ancient and powerful of our kind to choose between honor and law. You call this simple assistance. I call it grocery shopping, Sarah said, finding her voice. He needed help understanding how humans buy food. I showed him around the store and gave him some advice. If that somehow created magical obligations I didn't know about, then maybe the problem isn't with humans not understanding dragon law. Maybe it's with dragon law being too complicated for normal people to avoid breaking it accidentally. A ripple of reaction went through the dragons, circling overhead. Some roars of outrage, others that might have been amusement. Valdris's eyes narrowed. You speak boldly for one whose species has existed for barely a moment in cosmic terms. I speak honestly for someone who got dragged into this situation without warning or explanation, Sarah replied. 3 days ago, I was an accountant trying to make rent. Today I'm apparently the cause of an interspecies diplomatic crisis because I was polite to someone in the pasta aisle. If that doesn't qualify as a cosmic joke, I don't know what does. Valdris actually smiled at this, revealing teeth that could have served as swords. Humor in the face of overwhelming power. Interesting. Tell me, human child, do you understand what your dragon friend has risked by protecting you? He's explained some of it. War with his own species, exile, becoming an outlaw. All because he thinks basic decency between species is worth preserving. And do you agree with his assessment? Sarah looked around the clearing, at the massive dragon interrogating her, at the dozens more circling overhead, at Draken standing tense and ready for whatever came next. She thought about the past few days, about how quickly her life had changed from mundane to extraordinary. I think, she said carefully, that any species smart enough to build starships and live for thousands of years should be smart enough to figure out how to coexist with their neighbors without starting wars over grocery shopping incidents. Valdris threw back her massive head and made a sound that took Sarah a moment to recognize as laughter. Grocery shopping incidents, she repeated. I will remember that phrase. The scalekeeper's expression grew serious again. Draken of the northern reaches, your human makes a compelling point. Our laws have become so rigid that they criminalize basic social interaction. This is problematic. Then, you'll withdraw the charges? Draken asked hopefully. I cannot. The law of separation has been violated, and the council demands satisfaction. But I can offer you an alternative to outlaw status. What alternative? Valdris raised the dark metal staff. Trial by ordeal. You and your human friend will be given a task that, if completed successfully, will prove that cooperation between our species serves a greater good than separation. If you succeed, the charges are dismissed, and the laws must be reconsidered. If we fail, then you both forfeit your lives, and the separation laws are reinforced permanently. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. What kind of task? Valdris's silver eyes gleamed. Are you familiar with the concept of the Flame Covenant? Human child? Draken mentioned them. Dragons who want to prevent humans from advancing technologically. More than that, dragons who believe that human civilization must be pruned before it becomes a genuine threat to our existence. They have been gathering strength and support within our society for decades. Draken stepped forward. Valdris, what has the Flame Covenant done? They have stolen something that belongs to all dragonkind, the Heart of Binding, an artifact that controls the ancient agreements between our species and yours. With it, they can break the magical compacts that have maintained the balance of power on this world for millennia. Sarah didn't understand all the implications, but the expression on Draken's face told her this was catastrophically bad news. What would happen if they broke these agreements? Chaos, Valdris said simply. Every supernatural species on Earth is bound by the ancient compacts. Without them, there would be no restraints on any of us. Dragons could openly hunt humans. Humans could develop weapons specifically designed to kill dragons. Other species would be forced to choose sides in an escalating conflict that would devastate the planet. And you want us to steal this thing back from them? I want you to prove that cooperation between species can accomplish what neither could achieve alone. The Heart of Binding is being held in a fortress that is impregnable to dragon assault. It is warded against our magic and defended by weapons that can wound even elder dragons. But it is not warded against humans. Draken's eyes widened with understanding. You want Sarah to infiltrate the fortress while I provide support. I want to see if a dragon and human working together can accomplish what the combined might of the Dragon Council has failed to achieve. Valdris fixed her silver gaze on Sarah. Are you willing to risk your life to prevent a war between our species, human child? Sarah looked at Draken, at the dozens of dragons circling overhead, at the ancient Sasquatch who had provided them sanctuary. She thought about her quiet life as an accountant, about the strange chain of events that had led her to this moment, about the choice between a mundane existence and becoming part of something larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. If I say no, she asked, what happens to Draken? He faced his trial by combat against champions of the council. Given the number of dragons who consider his actions treasonous, he would not survive. Sarah took a deep breath. Then, I guess I don't really have a choice, do I? Valdres smiled again, and this time Sarah saw something that might have been approval. Wisdom and loyalty. Perhaps there is hope for cooperation between our kinds after all. High above them, the circling dragons began to disperse, their massive wings carrying them back toward whatever secret places they called home. But Sarah noticed that several of the smaller ones remained, hovering at the edges of the clearing as if standing guard. How long do we have? Draken asked. The Flame Covenant plans to use the Heart of Binding during the next conjunction of the moons, 3 days from now. After that, the magical resonance will make the artifact impossible to move for another century. 3 days to plan and execute an infiltration mission against a fortress defended by dragons who wanted to start an interspecies war. Sarah had thought her week couldn't get any weirder, but apparently the universe wasn't done with surprises yet. Where is this fortress? She asked. Valdres's expression grew grim. In the last place anyone would think to look for it, directly underneath one of your major cities. As the Scalekeeper began to explain the details of their impossible mission, Sarah realized that her life as a struggling accountant was officially over. Whether she survived the next 3 days or not, she would never again be just another human trying to make rent and buy groceries. The only question now was whether she and Draken could prevent a war that would reshape the world or die trying. The fortress of the Flame Covenant turned out to be hidden beneath the Seattle Space Needle. Sarah stood in a coffee shop across the street from the iconic landmark, nursing her third espresso and trying to process the intelligence Valdres had provided. According to the Scalekeeper's sources, the entire underground structure of Seattle Center had been gradually excavated and expanded over the past 50 years by dragons posing as city engineers and construction workers. It's actually brilliant, Draken admitted grudgingly. He was disguised again in his human form, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look like any other Pacific Northwest tech worker. Hide in plain sight, right underneath one of the most recognizable structures in the region. No one would think to look for an ancient dragon fortress beneath a tourist attraction. Sarah studied the building layouts Valdres had somehow procured. The official maps showed utility tunnels, storage areas, and the basic infrastructure needed to support the Space Needle and its surrounding buildings. The classified intelligence showed something entirely different, a vast underground complex that extended deep into the bedrock, with chambers large enough to hold dozens of dragons and magical defenses that would turn any direct assault into a suicide mission. Explain to me again why these magical defenses won't work against humans, she said. Dragon magic recognizes draconic life force signatures, Draken explained. The wards are specifically designed to detect and repel beings with our particular magical resonance. Humans don't have that resonance, so you'll essentially be invisible to their primary defensive systems. What about their secondary defensive systems? Those would be the dragons guarding the place. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. Right, so I have to sneak past magical defenses that can't see me, but can definitely see you, then get past an unknown number of dragons who very much want to kill humans, steal an artifact I've never seen from a location I can only guess at, and then escape before they notice it's gone. That's a reasonably accurate summary, yes. And you'll be doing what exactly? Draken's expression grew troubled. Providing distraction. If I can draw enough of their attention to the perimeter, it should give you an opportunity to infiltrate the inner chambers. Sarah didn't like the sound of that. What kind of distraction? The kind that involves making myself a very obvious target while you do the actual work. Draken, that's a terrible plan. Do you have a better one? Sarah stared out the window at the Space Needle, thinking furiously. Actually, maybe I do, but you're really not going to like it. 2 hours later, they were sitting in a different coffee shop, this one in the basement of a downtown office building. Sarah had spent the time between locations making phone calls and sending emails using her accounting background to research something that had occurred to her while studying the building layouts. Property tax records, she announced, spreading printouts across their table. Every building in Seattle has to pay property taxes, including city landmarks. And property tax assessments require detailed floor plans and utility surveys. Draken looked confused. I'm not following. The official city records show the Space Needle and Seattle Center having a certain amount of underground infrastructure, utility tunnels, storage, basic support systems. But if the Flame Covenant has been expanding that infrastructure for 50 years, they've had to account for it somehow. Sarah pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. According to the tax assessments, the total square footage of underground space should be about 42,000 square feet. But according to utility usage records, power consumption, water, sewage capacity, the actual functional space is closer to 300,000 square feet. Meaning there's 250,000 square feet of space that officially doesn't exist, but is definitely being used for something. The city has been unknowingly providing utilities for a secret dragon fortress for half a century. Draken stared at her calculations. That's actually brilliant detective work. But how does it help us infiltrate the place? Sarah grinned. Because I know exactly how we're going to get in. And it doesn't involve you making yourself a target. That night, Sarah found herself crawling through a maintenance tunnel that officially didn't exist, following power cables that led to areas not shown on any city map. She wore a coverall borrowed from one of Draken's mysterious contacts and carried a toolkit that looked legitimate enough to fool casual inspection. The plan was beautifully simple. Pose as a city utility worker conducting a routine inspection of electrical systems. The tunnel system was extensive enough that she could access most of the underground complex without having to pass through heavily guarded areas. And her accounting background had given her enough knowledge of municipal infrastructure to fake her way through basic technical conversations. Draken was following a parallel route through larger maintenance corridors, staying far enough away that the magical detection systems wouldn't register his presence, but close enough to provide backup if things went wrong. They stayed in contact through earpieces that looked like standard work radio equipment. I'm seeing junction boxes that definitely aren't on the city's electrical grid, Sarah whispered as she crawled past panels marked with symbols that looked more like ancient draconic script than standard electrical notation. Stick to the main power lines. Draken's voice crackled in her ear. They'll lead you toward the central chambers. Sarah followed the heaviest cables through a series of increasingly elaborate tunnels. The basic concrete and steel construction gradually gave way to something that looked more like carved stone, with walls that seemed to absorb sound and lighting that came from no visible source. I think I'm getting close to something important, she reported. The architecture is definitely not human anymore. Be careful. If you can sense the change, you're probably approaching the inner wards. Sarah emerged from the maintenance tunnel into a chamber that took her breath away. It was massive, easily the size of a cathedral, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in the flickering light from torches that burned with no visible fuel source. And in the center of the chamber, suspended in a pillar of what looked like solid light, was the heart of binding. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a crystalline structure about the size of a basketball, with internal geometry that hurt to look at directly. Power radiated from it in waves that Sarah could feel even without magical sensitivity, like standing too close to a high-voltage electrical line. I found it, she whispered into her microphone. But, Draken, it's not just magical. It's alive somehow. That's impossible. The heart of binding is an artifact, not a living. Draken's voice cut off abruptly as emergency lighting began strobing throughout the chamber. Alarms that sounded like dragon roars echoed off the carved walls, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Sarah, get out of there now. Draken's voice was urgent and filled with static. The detection grid just lit up like a Christmas tree. They know you're there. But it was too late. Dragons in human form poured into the chamber from concealed entrances, surrounding Sarah before she could retreat to the maintenance tunnel. They were all larger than normal humans, with the same metallic skin tone and golden eyes she'd first noticed in Draken, but these eyes burned with hostility and barely controlled rage. "The human thief," said one of them, a woman with silver-white hair and scales that showed through her skin like chainmail. "How convenient that you've delivered yourself directly to us." "I'm not a thief," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm a city utility worker, conducting a routine inspection." The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "In the deepest chambers of our fortress, surrounded by magical defenses that should have detected your approach from miles away?" "I think not." Another dragon stepped forward, this one male with coal-black hair and red-tinged eyes. "The question is whether she's working alone or whether the council has finally decided to take direct action against us." "I'm working alone," Sarah said quickly, hoping to draw attention away from Draken's presence somewhere in the tunnel system. "I'm just here to return something that was stolen." "Stolen?" The silver-haired woman's eyes flashed with anger. "The heart of binding belongs to dragonkind, not to the weak-willed fools on the council who refuse to use its power properly." "And what would be the proper use?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious despite her fear. "Ensuring the humans remain in their proper place," the black-haired dragon replied. "Your species has grown too powerful, too numerous, too dangerous. The heart will allow us to modify the ancient agreements, to place limits on human technological advancement and population growth." Sarah felt sick. "You're talking about mass murder." "We're talking about species survival," the woman snapped. "Dragons have ruled this world for millennia. We will not be displaced by clever monkeys who learn to make fire." "But you're wrong about humans being a threat," Sarah protested. "We can coexist." Draken proved that when he allowed himself to be enslaved by debt law to a pathetic creature like yourself. The woman's voice dripped contempt. "That fool's weakness does not reflect the capabilities of true dragons." That was when Sarah realized something important. These dragons saw her as fundamentally inferior, barely more intelligent than an animal. They were so convinced of human weakness that they hadn't bothered to search her properly or confiscate her equipment, including the small device Valdris had given her, hidden in what looked like an ordinary utility meter. "You're right," Sarah said, slowly reaching for her toolkit. "Humans are weak compared to dragons. That's why we've had to get creative about solving problems." "Creative?" The black-haired dragon laughed. "What creativity could a lower species possibly?" Sarah activated Valdris's device. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The pillar of light holding the heart of binding flickered and died, dropping the artifact into a containment field that Sarah could only see as a faint shimmer in the air around the crystal. At the same time, every magical system in the chamber went haywire. The torches flared and guttered, the carved symbols on the walls began glowing erratically, and the dragons themselves staggered as their own magical defenses were disrupted. "Electromagnetic pulse generator," Sarah explained cheerfully as she snatched the heart of binding from its failing containment field. "Turns out that mixing human technology with dragon magic creates some very interesting interference patterns." The silver-haired dragon was already beginning to shift in her true form, but the magical disruption was slowing the transformation and making it clearly painful. "You cannot escape, human. This fortress has 100 guardians." "Actually," said Draken's voice from above them, "it now has 97. Sarah looked up to see him dropping through a concealed opening in the ceiling, his dragon form compact enough to fit through the chamber, but large enough to be genuinely intimidating. 3 unconscious dragons in human form fell with him, landing heavily on the stone floor. "Sarah, catch." He tossed something toward her, a harness that looked like it was designed for rapid extraction. She caught it and quickly buckled it around her waist, still clutching the heart of binding. The artifact was warm in her hands and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, but there was no time to examine it more closely. "This is impossible," the black-haired dragon snarled as his own transformation accelerated. "No human could have planned this." "You're right," Sarah called back as Draken's claws closed around the harness straps. But a human and a dragon working together? That was creative enough. They shot upward through the opening Draken had create.